Hello, I'm Peter McCullagh, Professor of Statistics at the University of Chicago. On my right is Nancy Reid, Professor of Statistics at the University of Toronto. On my left is Professor Sir David Cox, Warden of Nuffield College, Oxford. And we're here today to record a conversation with Sir David for the American Statistical Association series on distinguished statisticians. Sir David has had a long and distinguished career, and I am going to give a very brief summary of it. He grew up in Birmingham and attended Handsworth Grammar School, subsequently went to St. John's College, Cambridge, where he read mathematics during the war. Towards the end of the war, he spent 2 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, studying aircraft wings and working on problems connected with the strength of materials. Subsequently, he moved to the Wool Industries Research Association in Leeds, during which time he completed his PhD at the University of Leeds, and in 1949 published the first of his many books, Statistical Methods in the Textile Industry. After that, he held a sequence of university positions, first as assistant lecturer at Cambridge from 1950 to 55. Then comes the North American period, where he spent 18 months at the University of North Carolina and visited other places in North America. Later, he became reader at Birkbeck College, London, and then professor at Birkbeck College, and then again professor at Imperial College, London, where I first met him. And finally, he moved in 1985, I think, to Nuffield College, Oxford. He has received awards and honours too numerous to list. 10 honorary degrees at the last count, Guy Medal in silver and gold of the Royal Statistical Society, Fellow of the Royal Society, foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Danish Academy of Arts and Letters, foreign associate of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He was knighted in 1985. He has served as president of the Royal Statistical Society, the Bernoulli Society, and is currently president-elect of the International Statistical Institute. He has published 14 books and over 200 papers. That's only about half of the awards and honors. David, there are enough awards and honors there for half a dozen lifetimes. But I want to start by figuring out where you come from, what your background is. Your family, I believe, were retail jewelers. Can you tell us about that? Were you ever tempted to go into the business? It would in some ways be as remunerative, perhaps, as a physician at a British university.
No, my parents left school when they were 14. My father was not a retail jeweler, he was what they call a master die sinker. That's to say, he cut metal dies that were the basis for making jewellery. And that's an industry he would, I guess, have quite liked me to go into. It was a very, very small family business. And I guess he would like me to, he never said so, but he would like me to have gone into that. But the English jewellery trade has collapsed completely. It no longer exists. That would have happened more rapidly, perhaps, if I'd gone into it. But,
was there an academic tradition at all in the family? Were there any brothers or sisters?
I'm an only child. My mother would love to have been a school teacher, I think. But as I say, she left school at 14, so had no option.
Uh-huh.
And I have a very, very, very distant relative who was an aeronautical engineer, but very distant. I mean, I've seen him about twice in my life.
So you were essentially the first one in your family to go into higher education.
Yes.
Handsworth Grammar School, what can you tell us a little bit about that? Were there some influential teachers there? What brought you into mathematics and mathematics first?
Well, there were some very good teachers of mathematics there, and I really wanted to be a chemist, I think, but the headmaster, who was a powerful character, said, no, you're good at mathematics, but you must go to university and study mathematics. And one tended to do what he said.
I see. It was like that.
Yeah. It was like that. And he was probably, I mean, I was a terrible experimenter, so that would have been rational.
I see. The transition from Handsworth Grammar School to Cambridge, was that a normal one for students at that school, or was it the rare exception who...
Well, no, the school had been in existence about 150 years. I think I was the second pupil to go to either Oxford or Cambridge.
Uh-huh. Now, you spent only 2 years as an undergraduate, rather than the usual 3. Can you tell us why that was?
Well, this was during the war. If you studied some subjects, you had 3 years exemption from military service. Mathematics 2, some subjects 1, and then you had the right to go back to complete your work at the end of the war. So I had 2 years. So I took this wasn't all that unusual. I took the 2nd year and 3rd year of the ordinary degree, of the mathematics.
You went straight into 2nd year?
Went straight into the 2nd year and did some of the 4th year work on the side.
I see. And
which was not, I mean, that sounds sort of a bit grandiose, but it was not totally uncommon.
I think it would help our audience to know a little bit about the mathematics syllabus at Cambridge at that time, how it compared, let's say, with modern syllabi. Was it heavily physics?
It was heavily in the British applied mathematical tradition. That's to say, there were several courses in hydrodynamics and several in electromagnetic theory, up to quite a high level, and waves, and ordinary and partial differential equations, complex analysis, real analysis, starting at quite a high level. The very first university lecture I ever went to started by the lecturer saying, I shall assume only that not A is A. And he proved that 2 plus 2 was equal to 4 in about the 4th lecture, as an illustration of the axioms of rings and fields and so forth. So it started out at a fairly shattering sort of level.
I can understand how that would make an immediate impression to somebody straight from high school.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a favourable one.
Quite.
Can you tell us about any eminent mathematicians that you encountered as lecturers?
Well, I went to one lecture by G.H. Hardy, and then a course of lectures by Dirac and Eddington, R.H. Fowler, shortish course on probability by Harold Jeffreys, and then there were other pure mathematicians around who were, I think, extremely good. Not always very good lecturers, but the content of what they... And there was a Cambridge style of handwriting at those stages, which proceeded northwesterly up the blackboard. Sorry, I got it the wrong way. It proceeded northeasterly up the blackboard, getting smaller as it went, hidden by the lecturer standing in front of it. Yeah. So a finely cultivated tradition there.
With the eraser on the left hand?
Yes, yes. Well, the real skill was to rub with the left hand, write with the right hand, and talk about something else.
I see.
I never mastered that myself, try as I did.
Martin Beale at Imperial College in my time had some of those characteristics.
I won't ask what was.
Besikovich, did you have any lectures?
I went to Besikovich's lecture. He was the only one who had a teaching style other than marching into the blackboard, writing at the blackboard, and at the appropriate instant as the clock came to 5 to the hour, retreating at high speed lest any brave student dare ask him a question. He interrogated students, much to everybody's great dislike. He would hover over people and ask them questions about intricacies of real analysis. So he was a teacher in, of course, a very fine research worker as well, but a teacher in the rather traditional notion of teaching.
Yeah, Hardy has a reputation of being a good lecturer. Is that your experience or not?
The lecture, I only went to one lecture by him, so I recall very clear.
Very clear.
Yes.
And Jeffreys writes very, very well, and his opinions come across very strongly in his writings, but apparently he wasn't at all like that in lectures. Is that your recollection?
Well, I went to one lecture. He gave a lecture one evening about Markov processes, and this must have been when he was writing the section in, his famous book, Methods of Mathematical Physics, on Markov processes. That was actually very good, but his general lectures were really quite ghastly. I think he was probably extremely nervous and unused to facing more than about 2 students at a time, faced with an audience of about 30.
You certainly don't get that impression from his writing of anyone who would have second thoughts about anything.
No. Oh, no, probably not. No, his writing is marvellous.
So, and from Cambridge, you were drafted essentially to the Royal Aircraft establishment. It must have been a lonely place after Cambridge and the excitement of mathematics and so on. What kind of work did you do there?
Mostly turn the handle of a Brunsviga. Anyway, the audience won't know what a Brunsviga is an old-style hand calculator made in Germany and built and designed to last 150 years without going wrong. And you turn the handle, made a very satisfying noise, but it was fairly slow producing answers. But one did it.
But you must have learned probability at some point, other than Jeffreys' lecture.
No, I'm thinking of doing that next year.
How did you make the transition from mathematics to statistics? What led you in the direction of statistics?
Well,
what were the circumstances?
A group of people used to come round to the university and interview second-year students. And there's a great, desperate shortage of statisticians in the government research institutes. And the assumption was that anyone who's doing reasonably well at mathematics, of course, either didn't have to know any statistic, but they could learn it in a day or so. It was that sort of subject. And so it was assumed that I knew something about, entirely fallaciously, I knew something about statistics.
That hasn't changed entirely.
No, it hasn't, has it? It's you still do find that attitude.
Yes.
Of course, we know that it's the most difficult subject there is to teach and learn.
Yes.
Now, what brought you to the Wool Industries Research Association? That seems to have had a big effect on your subsequent work in many ways.
Yes. Oh, well, a very happy accident. That one of the more interesting things I was involved with at Farnborough, it was the Royal Aircraft Establishment, was the question of a probability calculation about the strength of spot-welded joints. And essentially that's, I won't go into the details, but I worked out a solution to this problem. Very clumsily, but it was enough for the immediate purpose. And I was in the library one day, and I read a most beautiful paper by Henry Daniels on a textile problem that was the same. It was phrased slightly differently. It was basically the same problem, and he'd done some beautiful work on it. And as I went out of the library, there was an advertisement of a job to go and work with Henry. And at that time, the war must have ended a few months before, because I'd been released from the requirement to work in this place. And so it seemed, natural thing to do. I mean, the alternative would have been to go back to Cambridge and become either a mathematical physicist or perhaps an analyst.
I see.
Certainly not a statistician.
And what kinds of problems did you work on and at the Wool Industries Research?
Well, the point about the wool industry, you see, is that it involves everything from the biology of the sheep, the chemistry, the physics, the engineering, the operational research. So there's an enormous range of problems in all sorts of scientific disciplines. There were also extremely good people working there who were very, Henry had persuaded them that statistics was crucial to what they were doing. So they would come along with all sorts of quite challenging problems. And then also I was working more as an applied as well as an applied mathematician, strengths of materials and elasticity theory applied to these issues.
And we presumably got into stochastic processes, and from that...
Well, Henry, quite correct, this must have been about 1946. Henry said, well, the upcoming subject for which all statisticians must know about is stochastic processes. And he gave me a few key references, Chandrasekhar's paper and so on, and suggested I went to hear Maurice Bartlett's lectures in Manchester.
So you did that, and yes.
But it was thought, I think stochastic, I mean the perception was stochastic time processes, time series, statistics, it was all part of one. I think the subject then was less partitioned into fragments than
it's a bit like the Big Bang. You mean it fragments as it gets older?
Something like that.
Yeah. Nancy?
Well, I was going to ask then how you ended up back at Cambridge. It sounded like a very happy atmosphere at the Wool Industries Research Association. Lots of interesting problems and so on.
I don't know, really, is the answer. It was one of those... I think Henry Daniels, a post came up, and Henry Daniels, I don't think he pressed me to apply for it, but he certainly pointed out that there it was, and it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yes.
Had I not done, I would have stayed as an industrial research worker, I'm certain. Probably more as a mathematical physicist than a statistician.
Now, the Cambridge department at that time sounds like a very exciting group with Henry and Dennis, John Wishart, Frank Anscombe, yourself. Have I left someone out? John Wishart?
No, those were the permanent people. And then there were some very, very able students, of course.
Now, it's sometimes said of Wishart and the Wishart distribution that Fisher must have dictated it to him. Is that unfair of Wishart?
I don't think so. I mean, it's difficult to judge. I mean, this was 1930, and I knew Wishart from 1950 to his death in 1956. And people change over the years, but it is very, very hard to see how the Wishart that I knew in 1950 could have done this subtle calculation, which is so Fisherian in its sort of geometrical and analytical mixture of geometry and analysis. Very hard to see how he could have done it. But who knows?
But he had gathered together a very successful group at the same time, so he must have had lots of ability in some directions.
He was a very good administrator, scientific administrator, excellent. Yeah. And a balanced sense that the subject... See, his appointment was in the School of Agriculture. He was reader in statistics, reader being a sort of senior kind of associate professor. He was reader in statistics in the School of Agriculture. Tolerated by the mathematicians, just about. So he's in an awkward position, but he kept the group on a reasonable balance between theory and applications in a very effective way.
That's not always easy.
I'm sure it wasn't. No.
It's a constant tension.
No.
Did you have any contact with Fisher at Cambridge?
Not really. No.
Did you attend any lectures that he gave?
Fisher was professor of genetics at this time, and occasionally he would come to the statistical laboratory and go when there's a seminar by somebody he particularly favoured. And there were 2 evening lectures he gave that I went to, and then a seminar in Oxford. I think those were the only times I heard Fisher speak.
Mm-hmm.
Although there was intense interest in his work, and it may seem to the audience extraordinary that one didn't go and ask Fisher questions about his work, but I think Frank Anscombe, who had good relations, perhaps did this, but it was...
There were
questions were not well received, I think is one way of looking at it.
Do you remember the topic of any of the lectures?
Well, they were all connected in some way with his last book. I mean, they were the run-up to his last book, whatever it's called, Logic of Scientific Inference, or whatever it's called. So and these were kind of preliminary bits of it.
On fiducial inference, or?
More probably on likelihood. Reference sets and so forth.
Did you work with your colleagues? What was the collegial atmosphere like at Cambridge? Did you all talk about Fisher's papers over lunch or over tea, or did you tend to just meet at department meetings?
I find it very hard to answer that. There was certainly a lot of discussion going on. I don't remember exactly how it was organised. Yes. And it was often with doctoral students.
Yes.
I mean, the personal relations were very good. I mean, I don't mean to imply that they weren't.
At some point you got interested in the foundations. I'm thinking of the time leading up to your 58 paper on problems connected with statistical inference. What got you into that?
Curiosity, I suppose. Well, curiosity in one sense, and I'd been interested, and we'd all been reading Fisher's papers.
Trying to understand
Fisher's papers. What was he? Not believing that he was kind of by definition right, but trying to understand what he was getting at always. And then Jimmy Savage came to Cambridge in, I guess it would have been around about 1953 or 1954, and he had a big impact. I mean, he brought along the typescript of his book, which appeared a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And we all went through that, or at least Dennis and Frank Anscombe and I went through it.
Went through it, you mean? Were converted, or?
Well, you see, Dennis was converted. Frank, I think, was semi-converted. I was fascinated and completely and utterly unconvinced. But
what aspect did you find unconvincing?
Oh, I tried to relate it to practical experience. In as honest a way as it's very difficult to do these things, but as applied problems come along, one would say, well, is it really helpful to ask oneself what the subjective probability of this or that is? And I've found very few problems where
Jimmy was arguing on a very strongly personalistic basis.
Yes.
Not an objective Jeffreys type of Bayesianism.
I don't think it was as absolutely clear at that point as it became later. But of course there's a stronger, in the sense that there's a stronger, as I see it, there's a stronger clash between the personalistic prior and the Jeffreys prior than there is between Jeffreys and Fisher.
Right.
I mean, you would agree with that? Yes. Yeah. And I think that distinction hardened as Jimmy Savage, who was a most impressive man, got more and more convinced that he was in the right about all these matters. And his attitude became rather rigid.
Now, you made some rather, well, I do want to draw a distinction between strident commentary and frankness, but this was a frank comment in one of your inaugural lectures. I don't know whether it was your first inaugural lecture, first one. You know what I'm talking about. About the current trend, as it then was, towards Bayesianism being a giant step for mankind, but backwards. Maybe you left out the "for mankind" bit. I may be exaggerating it slightly, but how did that...
wasn't quite what I said. It wasn't quite. More or less, but not quite.
How did that affect relations with Jimmy?
Oh, Jimmy wouldn't speak to me for a couple of years. I mean, he could make... it was sad, I felt, in a way, that up to about 1960, he was, as already said, a most impressive man, most articulate man. He wrote beautifully. He argued verbally, powerfully, and polemically, very effectively. And I think he convinced himself that he was properly, that his way of looking things was the only honest way to do things, and that people who didn't agree with this were idiots or dishonest.
So he was the first evangelist, would you say?
Well, I suppose so.
First.
I'm
not sure he would be the first.
Well, he was an evangelist, yes. Right. But see, he could make remarks like that about other people, but that was all right, but not.
That's often the case, that the people who make the most strident comments have the thinnest skins.
What I actually said, you see, was that yes, I'm sorry. What I actually said was that the notion that all forms of probability could be subsumed under the notion of personalistic probability was a most imaginative step backwards. And I said that because I believe it to be true.
Okay.
I still believe it to be true.
Now, in your...
And then if I could just pursue that, I said this in a lecture, then I had to write the lecture up, and I thought, no, I'll leave that out, it's a bit... then I thought, well, I believe this, I must put it in.
I'm recalling it from 10 years, but I'll check it when I go back. Now, your 1958 paper shows that, well, one way of reading it is that the frequency theory of inference, as it then was, and to some extent as it still is a subject full of contradictions, and in many ways it would be enough to make anyone a Bayesian, but seemed to have the opposite effect on you. That's just curiosity. Like to comment on that?
It's a very strange way of reading that paper.
Well, in the sense that most of the contradictions that come in there between conditional calculations and non-conditional calculations don't occur in the if you're prepared to take the Bayesian baptism.
Yes.
Right.
And therefore one moves as far towards the Bayesian viewpoint as one can
without
paying the penalty of writing down these priors that
you seem to be willing to go a very long way to avoid that.
I don't see it like that, but
okay.
Yeah, I thought we agreed on these things. No, if you believe it, if there's a reasonable basis for a prior distribution, then of course everything becomes very, very much simpler and clearer.
I think even Fisher would have.
Yes, sure. I don't know controversy about that.
Now I want to bring up George Box. You've had a long, fruitful collaboration with George. Yes. Only 2 papers, but landmarks, papers that everybody knows. Can you tell us how that came about?
Yes, well, I first met George in the early 1950s, and we were both constantly plagued by people coming up and saying, Box and Cox, when you're going to write a paper together. We got so annoyed by this that there was only one possible answer. And I used occasionally to go to Manchester, and I stayed with George George and his wife one evening, and George suggested the topic, I'm sure. Some notes were jotted down on the back of an envelope. This would have been about 1953. And then George went to the States for a year, so nothing much happened. Then he came back, and I went to the States for a year, nothing much happened. And then I came back, and then he went to the States permanently, much to British statistics' loss. And so nothing much happened. And there was a sort of desultory kind of correspondence about it until 1963, when the ISI met in Ottawa. I'm sorry, Nancy, I can't pronounce Ottawa properly. Ottawa. And George arranged for 2 days before the meeting started, he arranged us to have an office and a typewriter on a building site in the outskirts of Ottawa. And the building site's now called Carleton University, but then it was a building site. And we sat there for 2 days, or maybe it was 3 days, and almost finished this paper. And we both went away. We're just trying to finish it up. And then my recollection is something like this, and I may be wrong. I'd be interested. I've never talked to George about it since, but my recollection is something like this. George had by then become a Jeffreys-style Bayesian, so there had to be this sort of treatment in the paper. And we both simultaneously, within a few hours, as I recall, across 4,000 miles apart,
couldn't have been independent at that distance.
Decided there was a serious error in the Bayesian analysis, and there was some correspondence, maybe some telegrams or phone calls or something, and we produced this idea of a data-dependent prior, which resolved the issue. George couldn't come to the meeting where it was read to the Royal Statistical Society, so I went along in great trepidation, thinking that I was going to be jumped on by all the Bayesians present for this heresy of the data-dependent prior, and there was no criticism of this at all, and I've really been waiting 30 years for somebody to come along and say, well, really the proper way to do it from Bayesian viewpoint is this. Of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with data. I mean, there are contexts where the prior must depend on the data, but I don't know that this is one. But you have to have it in there, otherwise you get absolutely crazy answers.
But it
that was...
There does seem to be something not quite satisfactory about a prior dependent on data not yet observed.
Well, not in well, in some context, it's inevitable, isn't it?
I take your word.
No, look, you're doing an experiment. You think out what the possible answers are going to be and how you're going to interpret them. You do the experiment and you get some answer that's totally different from any of the ones you expected. You look back at your prior considerations and you realize you made a silly mistake.
Oh, in that sense, I...
No, but this is an important sense. So, and then you would say, well, my prior distribution, which reflects everything I know other than the data, is influenced, in fact, in a certain sense, in that extreme case, determined by the data. There are great dangers in this, analogous to data snooping in the frequency theory of probability, but I mean, one of the weaknesses of the Bayesian approach as an all-embracing approach to statistics is that it doesn't allow you to I mean, I don't mean Bayesians don't do it, but that in the formal mechanism there's no clear way of saying, gosh, we got this absolutely wrong, we better start again with a different formulation. Mm-hmm. But I don't think, I'd agree with you in that I don't think that particular line of argument applies in the context I'm talking about here. I mean, it's a case of having a particular kind of dependence structure in the prior, I think. Uh-huh. Anyway, that's... So that was really just the one paper. I mean, that was... And
was the topic deliberately chosen so that there would be a box version of it and a Cox version of it? a Bayes version?
Oh no, it started, well, you see, it isn't quite like that, you see.
But that's the
Because
way...
we both contributed to both parts.
Okay.
And also it started out as a likelihood one, because in 1952 or 1953 I think we started, so it was 10 years between starting the work and publishing it. George had changed his views on these things.
There's still a puzzling aspect about the parameterization and so on that came up in the Bickle and Doxham paper many years later.
Yeah.
Do you find it puzzling, or
No.
do you feel it's been resolved in your second paper with George Box?
Yes, that was a bit annoying because I felt, I mean, Bickle and Doxham had a criticism of this work, and George and I wrote a commentary on this. And then I was very keen to try and get it down to one page of Jasa. And so we worked on it. They got it down to one page of Jasa, but by the time they'd put an elaborate footnote and so forth, it overflowed just onto the second page. So it really rather spoilt it, I felt, to have 2 whole pages devoted to the point.
I mean, I agree that there's a right and a wrong answer there, but is there, I mean, that's pragmatically, that is the case, but is there a mathematical problem of mathematical formulation here as to what a parameter means? Is a parameter simply a Greek letter in a family of probability models, or should a parameter for which you're looking for a confidence interval have some meaning above and beyond that? Is there an issue of that type involved?
Yes, I think so. The parameters should have, the parameters of interest at least should have, well, ideally some mechanistic or process in interpretation. If you can't have that, they should at least have a clear-cut physical interpretation that, as far as possible, is separate from the more detailed specification of the model.
I want to move on now, David, to one other topic which has taken up a quarter century of your life, a major British institution, Biometrica. You were at the helm for 25 years.
No, I was bailing out the...
bailing out the Bilgewater. Well, during that time, it must have been a busy time for you, handling 300 or whatever number of papers per year. Must have occasionally been a paper lost or a paper rejected that maybe you, in retrospect, you might not have rejected.
Yeah. Well, the most extreme example was a highly influential paper by Nelder and Wedderburn on generalized linear models, which was regarded as by referees and editors not justified for publication. Although it's been and perhaps there's some comfort for everybody. I mean, it shows the highly stochastic character of the refereeing process.
Well, I hope at least it was done quickly.
It would have been done very quickly, yes.
At least that doesn't slow the process down.
That's right. Would have been done within a month. Less.
But it should be some reassurance to all junior people and senior people. John was senior, and a colleague.
Not at that time.
Not at that time. So when you get a rejection paper from Biometrica, you can be destined for higher things, at least for influential things.
We do need to talk about your 72 paper on proportional hazards. In fact, some people might only know you for that paper, perhaps, but you've said many times that it really, some of the ideas for it grew directly from your work in stochastic processes, and nowadays the two topics of, well, your model gets used mainly in medical statistics, and stochastic processes is something entirely different. They've really grown apart. What are your thoughts on that? How was the stochastic processes connected to your 72 paper?
Well, the idea of thinking of events happening via a Markov process specified by an instantaneous transition probability is a sort of basic notion in stochastic processes. And at the same time that I was working on that, well, I was working on that paper over a substantial period, thinking about it over a substantial period, but at the time it was published, I also had written a long paper with Peter Lewis on multivariate point processes, both on the statistical analysis of them and on the probability theory of them. And those two are quite strongly linked. I'm just thinking in terms of hazard functions is what one does in setting up markup processes normally. And as I said earlier, commenting on something Peter said, at that time, I think part of the point is that at that time, certainly up to say about the late 1960s, one could work in stochastic processes without having a kind of tremendous, elaborate probability formalism to work with. The question of writing down some differential equations and solving them, if you could. And the technical apparatus was not as demanding as it is now. So it was easier to be a statistician and someone interested in stochastic processes than it is now. Well, I think that's a very great pity, because modelling, producing specific models for particular situations is getting more important in statistics. And often, when these are dynamic models, this will involve at least elementary notions in stochastic process theory.
How long had you been working on this idea? And to some, it will seem like a bolt out of the blue, but you're pointing out that it's not. It really stems naturally from your earlier work in stochastic processes. But how long had you been specifically working on the problem concerned with censoring? Let's look at it from that point of view.
Oh, 6 years.
6 years.
I mean, the point was not the formulation of the model and the censoring, which was immediate, but related to what I was saying in the lecture earlier about using bits of not using the likelihood of the whole data, but being a bit cunning about only taking part of the likelihood. That took a while to think out, for like 4 or 5 years. Although, I mean, once it's been seen, it's 5 minutes.
Yes, it's remarkable once you see it that it's kind of obvious. Yeah. I don't mean to put it, I mean the highest praise. Yeah. All the best ideas are of that type, but it's remarkable. Now, there were some concerns about the nature of the likelihood expressed in the discussion of that paper. You called it, as I recall, a conditional likelihood, and then various people questioned aspects of what makes it a conditional likelihood or not. And my recollection is you were a little coy in your response to that, saying, yeah, this needs to be looked into, whether the asymptotic properties really are satisfied or not. Did you have any concerns in your own mind?
No.
About whether they would, or you felt perfectly confident? Yes.
Yeah, but I think I should have done, but I didn't. I was pretty confident, but I don't quite know why. I mean, maybe I had a good reason that I'd thought out and forgotten, but I don't remember now.
And then that led to your subsequent paper on partial likelihood.
Which was just a clarification, really, of the thing. I mean, in a sense, the key paper was one of David Silver's of many years before on the connection between maximum likelihood for dependent random variables and martingales.
And did you use the theory of martingales?
No, but I knew about it. I knew that martingales were involved.
Yes, it was mentioned in the paper. In the 72 paper.
72
yes.
paper.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you something more about what you said in your talk, which was that we might, I'm not sure that I'm quoting correctly, but one valuable aspect of theory is that we might look to it for guidance or strategy in specific applications, and that it had the least to offer in its current state.
It hasn't much to offer.
Yes. Is this inevitable, or is our subject still immature in some sense? Or is that the nature of theory?
It may be the nature of mathematical. I mean, there's a distinction, obviously, between theory and mathematical theory.
Yes.
And I would feel that there should be much more that could be said. Something has been said, but about the strategy of tackling particularly complicated problems involving large amounts of data and lots of types of observation. Whether it can be set up as a formal mathematical system, I would be a bit sceptical. But I would see it as part of the theoretician's job, if possible, to have something to say about that.
David, I want to ask you about a question that has puzzled me for a long time and concerned me for a long time, and may be of interest to the audience, and that concerns the flow of research ideas. You have been very productive for a long time in terms of papers and books and so on. Do you ever have any concerns that the river will run dry?
Daily.
Daily.
Yeah.
But
and for the last 50 years or so. Yes, of course.
That doesn't really surprise me, but looking at it from a statistical point of view, you see this point process running along in time, going at 5 or 10 a year, and any statistical test is going to tell you that it is unlikely to run dry. Is there a contradiction there?
Limitations of statistical tests, isn't it? Not really. The prior knowledge hasn't been properly incorporated, has it, in that analysis? No, I take the question very seriously, that I'm constantly in the state of saying, never get anything useful done again.
Well, it's gratifying to hear that, and it's something I feel all the time, and that I'm gratified to know that you do too. And I think our time has run out, so David, I will now thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you here and to share your ideas with the audience, and Nancy, thank you for being here too. Thank you.